Good evening, everyone, and welcome to CEE's Economists on the Economy, featuring Emily Kolinski Morris, Global Chief Economist of the Ford Motor Company. Tonight's program will be a brief introduction, followed by some remarks by Emily, and we'll conclude the evening with some Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Zoom Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. There should be an option on the bottom panel. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Nan J. Morrison, President and CEO of the Council for Economic Education, for her opening remarks. Nan?
Thanks so much, Thomas. And I'm going to say good late afternoon to everybody. It's such a joy to welcome you, especially now when we have light again. The poet T.S. Eliot once famously wrote, "Midwinter spring is its own season." I'm so glad we have spring. I would like to suggest that post-pandemic spring might be its very own special Jubilee season. During the pandemic, I spent some time in the country at a friend's house, and I got to know many of her neighbors, including a woman who owns horses. Toward the end of the endless snow of February, I said to her, "This seems like a particularly hard winter." "Yes, but that is good news," she replied. "Okay, the grass will be good this spring, and that makes for strong horses, especially the young ones." I realized that her particular knowledge gave utility to and hope during a very hard winter. And it seemed to me that this is what we need at the end of our pandemic year: stronger children with hope for their futures. This is what CE strives to accomplish, demonstrating to and teaching kids that the world is comprehensible, that there's information as well as concrete skill sets for negotiating it and building better lives. In short, that economics and personal finance can work for them. It's not an entire answer, but is a necessary part of any answer. CEE does everything possible to bring this knowledge. We train competent teachers online and eventually again in person. We develop solid, accessible, and free resources for them. We develop programs to reach overlooked kids and communities. We develop programs to bring families into the learning experience with their children. We advocate with leaders across our nation for these subjects to be included in schools from K through 12. We make sure that we are there with new ideas, creating more access, delivering what works. This crisis brought home to me, our board, and our staff just how tenuous financial stability can be for many Americans, and the toll that acute and constant anxiety takes on our children. For fragile communities, for families living paycheck to paycheck, for kids who are already or struggling for a foothold, any foothold in a better, more stable life. It is our job to make sure that they can find it. We have a lot of work to do, so I'm particularly happy that we get to discuss the path forward with someone so adept at looking there. Knowing the present landscape so well, the changes in it give her a good shape and a good idea of the shape of our problems and opportunities for tomorrow. Of course, I'm speaking about our speaker today, Emily Kolinski Morris, the Global Chief Economist for Ford Motor Company. The title alone should be introduction enough. Emily manages Ford's corporate economics group with responsibility for global economic and automotive industry forecasts that support all aspects of the business, the ultimate strategy job. Prior to joining Ford, Emily spent 4 years as a fiscal analyst with the Michigan House of Representatives. In that nonpartisan position, she provided counsel to House members on program funding and performance and worked with stakeholders at all levels of state government. Emily also serves on our board, and I'm very happy to say that she is a wonderful board member, and we're so fortunate to have her. And she's also served as a judge at our National Economics Challenge. It's hard to manage a more dedicated and willing board member. She is a rock. Emily, over to you.
And thank you so much for such a kind introduction. And I'm really pleased, one of the silver linings of the pandemic has been, the opportunity to participate in more events like these without geography separating us. So although it would be lovely to see everyone's faces in person, I'm glad to be able to see and speak with so many of you virtually this evening. And I appreciate you joining on what I hope is a lovely day where you are. Spring has sprung indeed, Nan, certainly here in Michigan. I am going to share a few slides at risk of being a stereotypical economist. I can't do too much without a few pictures, but I thought I'd do something a little bit different in honor of Women's History Month. And I'm so pleased to be doing one of these events in honor of that month. I wanted to talk a little bit about some female economists, and in particular, a few that have been noteworthy for me over the course of my development as an economist and as a professional. So if you'll indulge me, I hope this will be interesting and also maybe a little bit fun. So let me begin. Let me see if there we go. All right, so this is Women's Contributions in the Field of Economics, subtitle, Female Economists Whose Names Everyone Should Know. And I know this is a very well-educated group, so probably these names will not be a surprise to you or unfamiliar to you, but perhaps there will be some little tidbits that you were not aware of. So first up is Joan Robinson, and these all have a personal connection to me. So Joan Robinson was actually, there was an award at my undergraduate college named after her, which I received as a senior graduating in economics. And of course, I was very curious, who is this person? At that point, I had not heard of her. And she was very cheeky. I absolutely love her. She was a British economist. She was one of Keynes's followers, and many of her works grew out of his general theory. And one of the contributions to economics that she's most known for was the concept of monopsony, which is sort of the opposite of monopoly. Instead of having one seller and many buyers, you have one buyer and many sellers. And it was one of the major arguments used when discussing and supporting a minimum wage. But one of the things I really love about Joan Robinson is that she has many, many wonderful quotes, and one of which I put up here in honor of the Council for Economic Education. Purpose of studying economics, not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but rather to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. So she was very much the insider's outsider or the outsider's insider, whichever way you want to think about it. But she was not one who assimilated, in order to be successful in the field. And I have tremendous respect for her for that. Next up is Anna Schwartz. Anna Schwartz co-authored A Monetary History of the United States with Milton Friedman. And you always hear Friedman and Schwartz, Friedman and Schwartz. And certainly that was one of the female economists whose names I first came across, as a student of economics. She did not share the Nobel Prize with Milton Friedman, though, even though the awarding committee said that that book was one of his most profound and most distinguished achievements. And it was indeed a significant book, and that book resulted in significant changes to the way that governments used monetary policy. It was really the first time that it started to become an active tool of policymakers in order to manage business cycles. And she just looks like such a lovely, happy person. I absolutely adore this photo of her, and I think she would have been a fascinating person to have dinner with. I think any of these ladies would have been certainly guests at a very fascinating dinner party. At the other end of the spectrum, here's another co-author, and let's fast forward several years. Carmen Reinhart, although their work certainly had some controversy, she was a co-author with Ken Rogoff of a very influential work on austerity following the global financial crisis, looking at basically the history of financial crises and what debt levels would do in terms of impeding the recovery following significant financial shocks. And that work was very influential in terms of the movement toward fiscal austerity following the global financial crisis. Again, you may or may not agree with that perspective, and certainly that's not the world that we are in today in this current pandemic, where it's recognized that fiscal policy is a very appropriate response. And I actually will come back to that a little bit later. But certainly, since I joined Ford Motor Company in 1997, right around the time of the Asian financial crisis, and then lived through the 2008-2009 crisis as the US economist at Ford, this work was certainly front and center in our thinking of how to gauge the recovery, and in fact was correct, whether directly because of the factors that they cited combined with other factors, but certainly the recovery from the global financial crisis was very slow by historical standards. And what I like about Carmen Reinhart, in context, having just followed the slide from Anna Schwartz, she was certainly not overshadowed by her co-author. So perhaps she learned from Anna Schwartz and from that history. She is currently the chief economist of the World Bank and remains a very active voice in global policy discussions. And then finally, of course, former CEE honoree at the Visionary Awards, I think 2 years ago now, but one of just the most impressive and truly delightful people. One of the most cited female research economists. I first became aware of Janet Yellen when I was in graduate school, and she was just, you know, it's kind of one of the few female economists whose name you came across when you were doing research. It was like this Janet Yellen keeps showing up, and I just felt such an affinity for her. You really don't realize how important it is to see names that you kind of connect with, or people that you connect with in your chosen field. And so Janet Yellen was kind of there as a beacon for me from very early in my career. And of course, subsequently, as I progressed through my career, she progressed quite amazingly through hers. And it was so satisfying to watch her become chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, president of the San Francisco Fed, first female chair of the Federal Reserve, and now the first US Treasury Secretary. So no presentation about female economists would be complete without talking about Janet Yellen. So thank you for indulging me in that little trip through women's economic contributions. Happy to talk more about any of these ladies or any of the many wonderful female economists working today who could also fill another very fascinating list. I wanted to take a few minutes now to talk about some more near-term issues, more current issues, and that is the impact of the pandemic on the auto industry and the economy. So I just have a couple of slides because I do want to leave lots of time for discussion and Q&A, and there are so many interesting things that we could talk about this evening. But let me just switch gears here and talk about, first of all, about auto sales. So the path of auto sales in the downturn was really quite interesting, particularly having also lived through the 2008-2009 financial crisis as an observer and a participant in the industry as well. Thinking back to 08-09, first of all, and looking at that lighter blue line, I have to say when we lived through it, that felt very precipitous. It felt like things were falling so quickly and that we couldn't find the bottom. And in hindsight, when you go back and you add up the data, it actually took 15 months from us to go from a 16 million industry sales pace to find the bottom, which was at 9.2 million units on a seasonally adjusted monthly sales rate in February of 2009. So for as fast as that felt, that was over a year of decline that we were living through and sort of updating forecasts and trying to figure out where the bottom would be. And of course, we remember the way that the crisis kind of happened in waves as well, with Lehman Brothers and then the additional failures and the mortgage crisis escalating. So it really was an extended period of uncertainty. By contrast, in the pandemic, it only took us 2 months to hit bottom. We went from a sales pace above 16 million units in February of 2020 down to 9.1 million units in April of 2020. And of course, in some ways, this was much easier to explain. Dealerships were closed, so clearly people were not going to be buying vehicles. But coming out of the pandemic, we're sitting in our forecast room and talking about what was going to happen going forward, and we were looking at an unemployment rate that we expected to see well into the double digits. And when we had seen that before, we looked at the path. We knew what had happened in 2008 and 2009 and the recovery path out of that. It took us 52 months from 2009 to get back to 16 million units of vehicle sales. It's not even on this picture because I didn't want to hurt the scale too much. We don't have that much future yet on the current decline. But it took us only 5 months to get back to a 16 million unit sales pace from that trough that we hit in April of last year. So this was a really challenging forecasting question, right? We had economic fundamentals and models based on things like the unemployment rate that would suggest that sales would be weak for quite some time. And at the same time, we were sitting month after month watching the sales pace recover in very rapid order. So it took us a little bit of time, but we began to settle on an idea, and it is something that's probably now being referred to as the K-shaped recovery. Although I have to say, I'm not a big fan of that word. I know we really have this innate need for some reason to describe recoveries with letters. But if you look at the pictures, just take a step back, not think about what they are representing yet. But if you look at these, I don't see anything on here that looks like a K. But really what the K-shaped recovery is trying to capture is the idea that after the decline, we have sort of two tracks in terms of the rebound, depending largely on what sector and what income group you fall in. So the charts on this slide come from a site called trackingtherecovery.org. And one of the things that came out of the crisis that was, really a good innovation, but, one with all innovations that required a little bit of massaging, was that people began to look for high frequency data to be able to understand, more real time what was going on in the economy. So we had things like the Apple mobility data, and economists tracking things like open table reservations to track restaurant activity, and box office sales from the entertainment industry, just to see what was going on in terms of activity out there. This particular source I really love because it was put together by a group of economists led by Raj Chetty and others through NBER and Harvard, who are well-respected economists and who went out and partnered with these private enterprises, but took that data and made sure that it was clean, that they were using it properly. They benchmarked it against the lagging economic indicators that it was meant to represent, to make sure that it was, a sufficient match to the population that it was intended to capture. So, these are data that I have some confidence in, and it really helped us to crystallize and to be able to sort of identify what was happening in terms of this sort of two-speed recovery. So let me just walk you through the charts, and the easiest way to look at it, I know some of us like pictures, some of us like numbers, but I think the numbers at the right in the colored text really help to tell the story. So let me start with the one labeled percent change in employment. This is the percent change in employment. The numbers at the right represent the difference from January of 2020 to January of 2021. And if you look at the declines, high wage workers, those making more than $60,000 a year, over the course of that year, obviously they saw a decline in the initial stage of the pandemic, but recovered pretty quickly to levels similar to where they were pre-crisis. And they're currently down about a net 1.7%. By contrast, those in the low wage category, had a decline, they had a recovery, starting to see another decline now again, as you had some renewed closures and other restrictions put in place with subsequent waves of the virus. But they are on net down nearly 29% from where they were in terms of employment levels pre-crisis. So we had a significant disparity in terms of the way that the cycle affected high wage and low wage workers. That is always the case to some extent, to be fair, but it was very, very pronounced in this particular downturn because of the nature of what was causing activity to slow. Those workers largely were in service sector activities, they were in travel and leisure, they were in restaurant businesses, and so on. But where it gets really interesting is when you look at the change in consumer spending. So the two charts at the right, the one on the top shows the change in consumer spending, again divided by income group. So if we look again at the numbers at the right, the low income group on net, comparing where they are as of February of this year to January, just pre-pandemic in 2020, they're about even. They had a huge decline in spending, as did everyone when the pandemic first hit. Fairly slow recovery, some wiggles there, particularly around the implementation of some of the recovery payments that were put out into the economy. But on net, they're about back where they were in terms of spending. The decline in spending is actually coming from the high income group. They're down a net 4.6% from where they were pre-pandemic. And the way to explain that, of course, we've all lived it. And now we've all started to understand this, right? That those high wage workers were still working, largely earning a similar salary to what they had been pre-pandemic, but they had significant constraints on what they were able to spend it on. So the final chart at the bottom right shows the change in consumer spending for a couple selected categories. The darker blue line is grocery, up 14.6%, as everyone started eating and cooking at home more. Restaurants and other similar establishments down about 14.4%. So actually kind of an interesting little parallel there, right? We're spending 14% more on groceries and 14% less on restaurants. Entertainment and recreation spending down over 50% from where it was pre-crisis. And again, we've had some wiggles in that as different activities have opened up or as holiday periods have occurred. But that's one of the areas where the spending went down and really has not come back yet. And that's one of the things that the high income group would tend to spend the most on. So what you've really seen is a decline in spending among upper income households. Some of that money has found its way into other parts of the economy. So autos have done well. As soon as dealerships reopened, folks had the money to spend and they were able to go out and purchase vehicles. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the behavioral changes around that in a minute. Things like collectibles, right? I'm sure many of you have observed this. Collectibles and antiques and things of that nature are soaring in value. I was just reading the other day about baseball cards, and things of that nature are seeing an increase. And not to mention, of course, the stock market also increasing. So that money is sort of finding its way into different sectors of the economy than where it had been. So that's kind of my story of the K-shaped recovery, if you want to call it that, or I would really call it sort of a two-speed recovery. So I wanted to close with a little bit of discussion around what we see coming out of the crisis, because as I mentioned, vehicle sales did very well, not just because of the excess income, that was available to be spent, but also because people sort of took a different view of what personal transportation represented for them. Certainly in areas where people might have been using mass transit, suddenly that became less attractive. And so personal vehicles became more popular, both new and used actually. Used vehicle sales also recovered quite significantly after the first few months of weakness. We've also seen some changes in behavior, though, around remote work and around online shopping that suggest that even though people are buying a lot of vehicles right now, if this behavior persists, those vehicles are going to last a lot longer than they did in the past because they're not necessarily being driven to and from work every day or even to as many personal shopping trips as they used to be. So fewer miles traveled means that vehicle holding periods can be extended. The vehicles can last longer, and that could potentially reduce new vehicle sales. And of course, another key risk is just, whether the recovery, materializes the way that we think it will. And those who are still affected by long-term unemployment, do we get them back into the labor force? That is still an open question, since many of those folks are still, unemployed due to again, closures and capacity restrictions. But the opportunities for the sector and for our sales coming out of this are really interesting. And a lot of them center on this shift in preference to personal vehicles. Personal vehicles, our chairman likes to say, sort of became the ultimate in PPE, right? You could go out and about in your little cocoon. People started taking road trips instead of trips by air. Realized maybe they needed a different household fleet to do that comfortably. RV sales also took off. Sales of boats also took off. And then people needed something to tow those boats with, which led us back to pickups and SUVs. So we saw, very strong demand for those sort of, personal recreation and transportation vehicles. The other area that really has taken off, and this was a trend that was in place before the crisis hit. And so that probably means it has, more legs than maybe some of the other behavioral changes that are very short term. But e-commerce and delivery vehicles, that was already something that we were seeing increase before the pandemic. And certainly with so many people quickly getting into online shopping, maybe folks trying online shopping that really hadn't thought they would do it, or weren't really sure how it would work. A lot of people did it out of necessity, and many of them will likely stick with it. And so we think that demand for commercial vehicles will remain very strong coming out of this crisis. And finally, given that people have maybe reduced their radius a little bit in terms of travel, there was a lot more interest in electric vehicles. People became a little bit less concerned about range anxiety. And at the same time, electric vehicles have become, continued to improve and become much better in terms of addressing some of those concerns. And so coming out of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of investment in electric vehicles and a lot of customer interest in electric vehicles. And so that is certainly something we see as an upside coming out of the crisis. So a lot of these, again, will remain uncertain for some time. These, may add up to a net positive, hopefully not a net negative. That doesn't tend to be my view at this point, but there's still, unfortunately, a lot left to play out in terms of both the pandemic itself and also how people adjust their behavior in the long term as a result of it. So it is never a dull moment. I've often told people, I joined Ford sort of reluctantly because I grew up in Michigan and everyone I knew worked for one of the auto companies, and I wanted to be global. I wanted to do international. And lo and behold, I joined Ford Motor Company and wake up every day talking to people around the world, thinking about things going on all over the world every day. And, it couldn't be more fascinating. And so 20 plus years later, here I am still at Ford Motor Company and loving every minute of it, because this is just such a dynamic business. And crises aside, these are always opportunities for huge growth and learning, and high demand for economists. So I'm very fortunate to be in the position that I am to be able to think about and talk about these trends. So perhaps with that, Nan, would that be a good segue over to Q&A time?
Thanks so much. And I have a lot of questions, and I know we have some in the Q&A as well. So let me just flip back to harken back to the last slide you presented, and we actually had a question about electric vehicles. So I'm wondering if you could dig in on that a little bit more. And what is Ford? The question is, what is Ford doing to respond to this? How are you thinking about it? How are you integrating it into your forecast? And I promise there's no one from General Motors or Mercedes or anybody else on the call.
I understand. And we actually spoke fairly recently about our plans in terms of electric vehicles. So I can share some publicly available comments on that. Our particular perspective on electrification is that we want to lead in the areas where we already have strength as a company. So we are investing significantly in electrification over the next say 5 years through 2025, really, to a total of $22 billion from, beginning from 2016. So that's including investments that we have already made. And what we're focusing on are the high volume areas. So Henry Ford originally sort of put the world on wheels by bringing personal transportation, to the masses. And so we're hoping to do the same with electrification. And we've started, of course, with our Mustang Mach-E, which is coming out this year and is extremely well received so far. And two other key products that we'll be focusing on are an e-transit, so for commercial applications, and also, of course, our electric F-150, which some of you may have seen receive some very positive press coming out of an unfortunate situation, which was the power crisis in Texas. But folks were able to use the onboard generator of their hybrid F-150 to power homes and help out neighbors and preserve food and heat homes and things of that nature with that onboard generator. So we're very excited to have that focus with regard to electrification. We think it's really important that it be, in areas where it can make the most impact. And so that's where we're starting.
Thank you. It's such an exciting field right now, an opportunity for all of us. So you started out by talking about some of the great women economists over time to current times. We happen to have another one on the phone with us. Another one of our board members, Loretta Mester, is on, and she has a question.
Absolutely.
Any
Wonderful.
concerns that supply chain issues will hurt auto sales, and any concerns that it will affect pricing and margins? And I would say this is a global question, right? Because you guys manage a global supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly it's a concern. I would have to say so far, we've seen very little evidence that it's affecting sales. We believe that the issue, given that we are led to believe that it's about a 6-month lead to sort of get capacity back in that had been taken out for the semiconductors. We're well into it. It was really, the issue was percolating toward the end of last year, but let's say it's a first quarter, second quarter of this year issue. We believe by the third quarter we'll have a more normal flow. And thus far we've gotten through the first quarter of sales with again, very little visible impact. So we're optimistic, but I think we need to watch it very closely. It's not just affecting autos, although certainly some of the impacts on auto production have been most noticeable and most public. We're very encouraged by the executive order to look into this, for the future in terms of securing domestic supply chains for key components. But I think everyone involved recognizes that's not a fix to the immediate problem. So it'll be, watch and wait for the second quarter, I would say. It appears that we'll be able to sort of get through it and then begin to rebuild inventories by the second half of the year. But I think, it's an interesting question more generally, because there's always a silver lining, right? And the silver lining here is that it certainly brought greater attention to the importance of having, a strong domestic supply base for critical components.
Yeah. And I was wondering, as you were going through some of the opportunities and risks, are those, do you see variation globally around that? We just talked about the supply chain in particular, but COVID has affected countries differently. Vaccine distribution is uneven. How is that going to affect sales and other aspects of your business across the globe as we come out of this? Do you see more unevenness than you might have in a normal year, or just any other downturn, as you pointed out earlier in your presentation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ann. And in fact, the interesting thing about this downturn, of course, was in the early stages, how synchronous it was, because everyone was really dealing with the same thing, in a very similar time frame. China was just maybe a month and a half ahead of us. So we had the tiniest bit of awareness what might be coming, as we watched them go through the process of closing down and, getting things under control and reopening. Now we are seeing a little bit more divergence, a lot of it having to do with, the public health response, both in terms of, public health measures like masking and social distancing, but also in terms, obviously, of vaccine availability and distribution. The US is doing certainly better in the last couple of months in that regard, and we're making good progress on vaccination. Perhaps opening up a little prematurely. I feel like I've seen this movie a few times already, so it gets a little bit frustrating sometimes. But we're sort of waiting for those two lines to converge in terms of the public health measures relaxing and the vaccines providing sufficient coverage. Unfortunately, Europe was slightly further behind the curve in that regard. So, many of the nations, particularly on the continent, are seeing more significant restrictions on activity currently because the vaccination rates are not moving as quickly as they need to be. And so we've had actually dealership closures happening again in places like Germany, and recently announced more restrictive measures in Paris, in France. So that is certainly a little bit of a headwind. And then, some of the emerging markets, obviously Brazil's been very prominent in the news, but the situation there is really concerning, not just from a regional perspective, but also from a global perspective, because of the risks associated with unchecked replication of the virus and potential additional variants, of which one already has come from Brazil. So it is a much more uneven picture at this point, but hopefully the vaccination rates will catch up globally, and that will help us to get on better footing. But as I said earlier, we're certainly not out of the woods yet, unfortunately, on the public health side.
So we had another question about one of the other aspects that you mentioned from that last slide as you're thinking about the future. How are you building the future of work issues into your forecasts? Because that's been that's also been written about quite widely. I don't know if I believe that the office is entirely dead.
Right.
Our team is waiting to see each other. But can you talk a little bit more about how you're modeling that future in terms of office space, commuting, will there be permanent job loss, public transportation, all of those things that you mentioned on that last slide?
Sure, absolutely. We can unpack that. It's such a fascinating topic. I do think that the idea of remote work has probably been oversold a little bit so far. We are still in a phase where remote work is largely driven by public health needs and not by purely by preference of the employers. Particularly for small businesses, which make up nearly 50% of employers in the U.S., they have tended to be less enamored of remote work, in part because of the nature of those businesses, and also because the resources to support it are just not necessarily there. And so I think we do have a significant portion of the workforce that will go back to work in a more traditional way. For those who have other models in mind, I think there are certainly some risks around commercial real estate that we should be thinking about, because in some markets, particularly expensive markets, if you have an option to either have a remote workforce or to have a hybrid workforce where you might have a lower cost location with people sort of doing part-time in person, part-time remote, and things of that nature, that could certainly be a challenge. And that's always something that sort of reverberates through the economy. In terms of vehicle sales specifically, I think that's where it gets a little bit trickier, because if you have a model that just assumes that people buy a car, drive it for X thousand miles and then dispose of it, then if they're driving it for fewer miles a year, it naturally means they're going to hold that vehicle longer, and that the sales turnover rate is going to be slower. But the other thing we've seen is that people have really come to value and appreciate having not just personal transportation, but if this is the way you're getting around, and if this is sort of your respite and your escape from your four walls, then people seem to be leaning toward having a nice vehicle with features that are meaningful to them, and particularly if they're using it for trips and so on. And so that that's the kind of thing that leads people to tend to turn over their vehicles more often, to take advantage of those new features. And so the net effect of that is probably a little bit harder to call at this point, because certainly new vehicle buyers tend to be upper income. So they're not necessarily folks who have a significant constraint when it comes to their vehicle buying choices. They do have a fair amount of discretion, and they may still choose to sort of treat themselves, as it were, when it comes to their vehicle purchase decisions.
It can be interesting to see how this all plays out over the next several years. Back on the electric car, one of our wonderful friends is asking, does Ford have a date when it plans to stop making internal combustible engines and switch to all electric?
Yeah, we've not announced a date. We do have some targets in Europe. I will point out that some of the dates that are out there, I would take with a grain of salt. A lot of them are specifically goals or ambitions, I think is one of the words that is used. So, clearly that's the way the industry is trying to go. But in terms of completely flipping that switch, we don't have a date for that in terms of our global portfolio. And I would, be cautious in interpreting any other similar dates. But I would expect that you'll see significantly higher penetration rates of electric vehicles over the next decade because there will be more product offerings available. And then if that's successful, you're going to see a very positive cycle building where, if they're shown to be successful, then more of them will be made, more will be available, and more people can purchase them.
I wanted to pop up to a bigger picture question, which you raised when you were talking about Carmen Reinhart around the need for fiscal austerity. We've just passed a big relief budget. This is not a political question, relief bill. It's not a political question, but our debt levels are certainly high and going higher. And I was just wondering if you had a perspective on that from just sort of, you're an economist and are busy looking at the global economy every day. And then there are some other questions on some of those big picture kinds of things like inflation, which has been discussed quite a bit in the news recently as well.
Absolutely. Those are great questions. And I'm sorry, we don't have Carmen Reinhart here to answer them for you, but I'll take my best shot at it. So I think it is a concern, and that's one of the things that that you may be seeing priced into markets right now, particularly when you look at bond yields. I think it's a combination of the higher debt levels and also the inflation issue, which you touched on. The debt levels are a concern, but they're sort of a concern we have to live with at this point, because I think the evidence has shown that the fiscal response is really the only effective tool that we have to sort of bridge the period from pandemic to post-pandemic. We're fortunate in the US that we have the resources to do that. I think some of the emerging markets that were fiscally constrained going into this crisis will have a much longer, more difficult road to recovery because of their inability to fully support the economy and households during the pandemic period. So I think it's an investment that is probably worth it in the short term, but it's certainly not without a cost. One thing, and it certainly is channeling the fiscal austerity movement here. One of the things we're certainly thinking about in terms of the medium-term outlook, and again, we're not anywhere near there yet because we're not out of the woods, but how quickly will governments step in then to try to get the genie back in the bottle in terms of deficits and debt levels post-pandemic? The UK has always been sort of a leader in that, right? And I think that's one of the canaries in the coal mine that many people will probably be watching to see how long do they wait and what happens when they do begin to take some measures to try to raise revenues and offset some of the fiscal costs of getting through the pandemic. So that's certainly a potential headwind as we look out, 5 and maybe 10 years ahead. The inflation issue is a little bit different because it's been, I think it's been really exciting for everyone after having no inflation for so long. I think people are getting really just, wow, inflation, let's talk about inflation again. We haven't been thinking about it forever. The breakdown right now suggests that, first of all, about half of the increase in headline inflation that seems to be in the pipeline is coming from energy prices. And so that's, that volatile component that sort of takes headline inflation up, but is not necessarily an inflationary process getting underway. The other half is certainly, more supported by the fundamentals. I would say that in many markets, including the US, before the crisis hit, we were worried about not having enough inflation. So, I personally am not that concerned if we do get a little bit of inflation coming out of this because, we were at risk of permanently falling, below target in the US and many other developed economies. So I certainly wouldn't completely dismiss the risk of inflationary processes getting underway, but I think given the supply, chain issues, given, the sort of mismatch of timing in terms of supply and demand recoveries, it's natural that we would see a little bit of inflation, and we will have to, keep a close eye on it. But I'm certainly not raising the red flag at this point.
So I'll tell you that our board chair also had a question about inflation, but wants to know if you have a prediction on the rate of what the 10-year treasuries will be at the end of the year. Not to put you on the spot. I think being me.
Right, exactly. I think there are probably a lot of folks on this call who, who have a better informed discussion on that, because it's really it's a market question at this point. I'm not a betting person. I'm a very risk averse. So, I try not to take positions that are too speculative. I I think, the fundamentals certainly support, yields where they are, but we've thought that fundamentals supported yields higher than they were for many years, and yields weren't there. So I've learned not to rely too much on what my economics tells me about where bond yields will go. And sorry, Barry, but that's all you're going to get out of me on that one.
Yeah, so so we had a question that I find actually kind of interesting about, when we were talking about where demand would come from for vehicles, we were focused on some of the shifts in work. But one of the things that our audience member is asking is, what about the impact of Uber, Lyft, DoorDash? Or is that having an effect on you? And do you actually factor that into car sales? Because there are very many different kinds of drivers that are engaged in these services, but it's certainly growing, has grown. People don't want to get into an old jalopy when their Uber driver comes to pick them up.
Yeah, no, that's another good example of a trend that was happening pre-crisis and sort of gets some tailwinds from what's happening now. Two separate pieces, right? So the Uber for people is one issue. I'm not sure that looks quite the same coming out of the crisis. I'm not a regular Uber user. I'm a suburbanite, so I'm using my personal vehicle parked out front in my driveway. But I think it's certainly a step up from public transportation, but it's not as good as being in your own vehicle. So we'll have to see where rideshare and ride hail sort of ends up. And also as travel demand comes back, because that's certainly one of the key drivers in a lot of the urban markets. In terms of the delivery business, though, that is a really interesting point, and it's definitely one that we've thought about. We've seen a lot of interest in that actually from our rental customers, the big rental companies. Many of them have programs to support those kind of drivers, whether it be Uber or sort of the DoorDash shipped kind of delivery business. So that is certainly something that was a niche and supported some sales, and I think will continue to do so going forward. I think longer term, if the delivery business continues to evolve, I'm not sure the extent to which it will continue to be this individual contractor using their own vehicle. So I think there's certainly a possibility, as the nature of that business evolves, that they may become more truly commercial vehicles and not necessarily the private sort of contractor. That's already the model in Europe. In the US, we do have more of that private sort of individual vehicle usage for these services. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
So another question from Loretta, as we're thinking about markets, any concerns about asset bubbles? Bitcoin comes to mind, actually, but I'm kind of sick of reading about that. Yeah,
I mean, it certainly is a concern, I think. It's anytime you see that much money out there, looking for a place to land, and again, you don't just see it in financial assets, but you see it in collectibles, you see it in real estate, right? Not commercial real estate, but individual homes and so on. There certainly is a lot of money trying to find a home. So the question really becomes, if you want to call it a bubble, then what sort of causes the bubble to deflate, right? Because the bubble itself is never the problem. It's always the popping of the bubble, and how quickly does that happen, or do you just have a little pinprick and it kind of the air comes out slowly, and that's the piece that no one really can predict. So are certain asset classes overvalued? I would say probably safe to say yes. Are they significantly enough overvalued that it would be a bubble, or that it would be a significant risk? That's much harder to say. And again, I'm not a financial economist, so I don't tend to take views on those questions, but that's just my perspective.
Okay, people are really fascinated by electric vehicles. So another question popped up in the chat. around the use of information that could come from these cars, because now, just like on your PC, you have to be so careful. Actually, this morning I discovered that somebody had broken into one of my email accounts and hijacked it, and hadn't done any damage, fortunately. But one of our listeners is asking, how do we protect information about our movements once we have cars that are emitting information all over the place, with sensors and other things, and feeding that back, and tracking where these cars are?
Well, I'd be interested to know the extent to which this questioner is concerned about that from their phone, because certainly that information is already widely out there. Doesn't make it any less of a concern, but certainly it's something that's already on the radar, no pun intended, I guess. So I can certainly speak to Ford Motor Company, and that's one of the reasons that we've been very careful in venturing into some of this space, because we do want to ensure that it's done in a safe way, both in terms of physical safety, but also in terms of cyber safety. And so we've built that infrastructure up very deliberately, to have appropriate protections. We recently announced a partnership with Google. That the data that they see versus the data that we keep in-house is very, the individual customer data, stays entirely under our roof, doesn't go up into the cloud. And so we've been very careful throughout this process to make sure that we're protecting individual customer data. I think it's a very important question for all of us to ask as we think about, what services we want to engage with. And no matter what it is, whether it's your Starbucks app or, whatever you're using, you're always trading some degree of privacy for some benefit. And that's something that I think we as consumers have maybe become a little bit immune to. But certainly as we go into this next step with, including cars in that ecosystem, it's something that we all need to think about. So I think companies will do their best to enable those protections, and you want to be careful who you do business with. Make sure you understand what their protections are, and then also make your individual choices in terms of which services you want to enable.
So, is there anything else that you think that might be happening in the economy that we're going to view a little differently in this recovery than we have viewed in past recoveries around equity? Because now that is an important way that we think about the economic impact on our country. It's not just one. Started out with some slides around that, and of course Raj is amazing. He'll be one of our honorees this year. And I'm wondering if you see any, how companies can help with this in terms of making it a little bit more equitable. The data was very interesting that we showed. And are there ways in which you think, and this is going a little further afield, but even just corporately, that we can make sure that it is a more equitable recovery for everybody? I mean, I know that we've just sent out checks to a lot of people. But is that really gonna manage it? And is this something that companies are thinking about, as well as our nation's economists, as we move forward? Because here in New York, it's not an equal recovery for sure.
Right, and unfortunately, as I said, that's been a feature of many of the recent business cycles, but very pronounced in this one. I'm cautiously optimistic on that front. I think that what the pandemic has sort of highlighted in many different areas is, the cost of what appears to be inexpensive, right? There's the old saying that economists have, that there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? Well, when you have a lot of low-wage workers, when you have low-cost goods coming from overseas, those things appear low cost on the surface. They have a low price tag, but there is a hidden cost associated with that ecosystem. This highlighted a lot of those discrepancies in in bold. And so what we really need to do as a society is, make some choices in terms of, what price are we willing to pay all in, for those conveniences. And so hopefully that will, lead to some more equity, higher wages in these sectors that are arguably undervalued. I've been doing some, other research, for another presentation this month about work done by women, and the percent of women in low wage occupations is just, still just staggeringly high. So I do hope that there is some, both some policy response, but I think that there also needs to be some social awareness in order for it to have that momentum. I know one thing that really stood out to me being home with my children as they were, doing online school, was just observing, what amazing work our teachers do, right? I mean, there's no question they are underpaid. I will I will go on record as saying that, because I don't care if someone wants to quote me, although that's certainly not an official position of Ford Motor Company, but teachers are underpaid. They do incredible work. The resources they provide that I think society is hopefully now better aware, not just in terms of education, but in terms of caring for our children, while parents are at work, right? It is not childcare, but it certainly serves that function in many ways, in terms of making sure that our children are in a safe and positive environment, every day. So I hope that more parents have the chance to see that firsthand, and that will again build this sort of social momentum toward maybe revaluing some of those important contributors to the economy.
Well, that is a lovely final statement. You started off by talking about some of the amazing female economists that you admired so much and who'd influenced you. I'd say that we're continuing along that path with you and Loretta in our midst. We need more people just like you to guide us and to inform us, and for young women to see the role models that you are to them. You also happened to mention that Janet Yellen was an honoree at our Visionary Awards 2 years ago when we were live in New York. This year, sadly, will be virtual again, but we hope that everybody on the call will join us on June 9th for our virtual Visionary Awards. I promise you we're going to be live next year. We have a whole year to figure this stuff out and get our shots. But we will be actually honoring Raj Chetty as our Economist honoree for all of his amazing work on economic mobility and intergenerational wealth transfer, and the impact that our financial environment has on different segments of the population. And as well as Paula Vallant, who's a top endowment manager, one of the top endowment managers in the country. She's at Bowdoin, also an unusual field for women, sadly still. And Pete Stavros, who is very committed to bringing ESOPs, which I'm sure many of you know, employee stock ownership plans, to the industrial companies that he manages as part of KKR's portfolio, to make sure that everybody can participate more fully in economic growth that they are actually contributing to. So I think it's going to be a fabulous event. Emily, thank you so much for a very varied conversation among many topics. We just figure, oh, economists, they're smart. We can just ask.
Economists, yeah, know a little bit about everything, right? Just enough to be dangerous, unfortunately. But
exactly.
I hope I did the questions justice. They were all wonderful.
So thank you so much for joining us and for all you do for CE, and to our guests. Thank you so much for joining us and for an engaging chat and some great questions, as Emily said, for her and for us to hear. So we hope to see you at another event soon, and certainly again at our Visionary Awards on June 9th. Thanks, everybody.